So I'm here with Jack Carr, who's standing for Director of Representation. You promised in your manifesto to assess Reading Week. This is one of your big promises.
Yes.
Every DoRep that I've interviewed, and even Teddy before that, before we did video interviews, has promised something on Reading Week, and yet none of them have delivered. Why do you think you can change that?
I think it's probably important to take into account why the previous Directors of Representation have failed to deliver a Reading Week. And ultimately, what it comes down to is just the calendar. Unless someone can magically find a way of moving Christmas a week later, we just can't create an extra week that we could all go off and have a break that's complete. It's impossible. However, previous DoReps have always been trying to assess this problem on a university-wide level, and it just doesn't work. But through the Education Committee this semester, that's the school presidents, the faculty presidents, the DoRep, education officer, various other people, as well as the proctor and the deans, so also senior university management. We've been looking at solutions that could be a bit more novel.
What sort of solutions are you talking?
So what we're talking about is actually, rather than looking at the university, we're thinking look at schools, and even go further, look at the actual modules themselves, and try and find ways of either having weeks where you are completely off, or when that is not possible due to course content, to have a slightly lesser workload for that week. Ultimately, it's not the same as a holiday, but I am addressing this as a welfare issue more than I'm addressing it as a need to be completely off. I think that the constant just the go nature of semester one at the moment is a massive stress for all students at the university.
One of the things you talked about in that was the Education Committee. Yeah. You've got that experience, but you've never been on the SRC or SSC. And for example, Fallon Sheffield, who's standing against you, has. Do you think you've got enough experience to be DoRep?
Of course. Ultimately, SRC experience is just a very small part of the DoRep's role. There's a lot of other components that you need to have. And Education Committee, which I have been on, is a massive part of that role, which should hopefully be lessened in favour of welfare issues in future years. However, in terms of SRC experience, just because I've not sat on the SRC as a voting member doesn't mean that I have not been a part of the system. Last year, just after the rectorial election in which Catherine Styler was appointed, myself and another student put forward a motion by petition, which was accepted, that had over 130 signatures. And ultimately, that shows that even as an outsider, I was able to use my understanding of the SRC to put forward my agenda and ultimately have it go forward right through to university level.
Another one of your big policies and something close to your heart is about extenuating circumstances. You say in your manifesto there's many issues surrounding students that have extenuating circumstances, but what real policies do you actually have on this? What do you have in terms of the meat of the policy?
Extenuating circumstances is a very big umbrella term. Firstly, I should probably explain what they are. It could literally be anything that adversely affects your academic study without being something that is within your control. So that could be health problems, both mental and physical. It could be temporary, like a cold that's just affecting you the day before a presentation, or it could be long term. It could be bereavement. It could even just be problems in your friend group or relationship problems. And the university does have a policy for how these should be dealt with by the directors of teaching in each school, which you go to get in terms of like getting this dictated in appeals, and ultimately they decide how it's going to be implemented within their academic school. At the moment, through my experience, but also experience of many other students that I've spoken to, this is implemented very, very haphazardly across the schools at the university. It can be, in many cases, schools rightly do all that they can to support students that are having problems, but there are some cases where there's a massive burden of proof put onto the students themselves rather than onto student services, for example, who might not be taken into account as much. And I really strongly believe that you should never have to go into a meeting with the director of teaching and justify why you have physical health problems or mental health problems. It's categorically wrong. So in terms of actual policies, in semester one next year, if I'm elected, I would like to run a review probably through the Education Committee, because the school presidents have the relationships with the directors of teaching, to actually establish what the directors of teaching themselves say they do within their school. But I would also want to run some kind of survey, probably in conjunction with student services, to work out what's going on from the student perspective as well. And then from that kind of, once we have some hard evidence-based data, we can put forward a paper to the Learning and Teaching Committee, which is the main committee for the university's management, which dictates how this kind of policy is implemented across all schools. And we can identify best practice, and we can also identify where we are really, really falling short.
Something else that could make a real difference to all students is study space. You talk about the library redevelopment that's happening, but what can you realistically do about that? Because the plans are already in place. What can you change?
They're not in place. Okay. What we know is going to happen is that the library is going to be redeveloped. We know that the current office space down in the basement will be moved out to Guardbridge, and that will obviously free up a significant amount of space within the library itself, hopefully for 200 to 300 additional study spaces. So we don't want to change that. I don't think any students are going to oppose the creation of more study spaces within the library. However, aside from that, nothing is actually set in stone. The Director of Representation is currently the only student representative who is going to be sitting on the development committee, and through that they will be able to implement any kind of basically the study space that's going to be created by the library has to suit the students. It has to be what we would like, and ultimately we have that ability to change it. They don't invite students to come onto their committees for development unless they genuinely do want to hear their voice, and through that we'd be able to make a real difference to the library.
Something else which affects all students is accommodation, and you talk about that in your manifesto, but that's not really in the DoRep's remit, is it? That's the president's job. Do you think you can change anything with that?
Accommodation itself, that is within the president's remit. However, what I'm talking about in my manifesto is my position on court, which is different. You don't go to the university court as the Director of Representation, you go as a trustee of the university. And in that, it's exactly the same as the president. The president doesn't go as president, they go as a trustee. And from that perspective, it would be silly for me not to have a stance on the long-term strategic plan in which I would actually have a say. So remits don't really count when you get to that level. It's a different job entirely, and it doesn't come down to the remit within. But
what would you do about that? What can you do?
What would I do about it? Well, I would just hold the very, very firm stance that without long-term development in accommodation and in various other resources, which we don't really take into account a lot. For me, in terms of commuting, it would be commuting students. I feel that commuting students are not represented very well at all at the university, and at the moment we do not provide a commuting space room that is adequate to the needs of those students. It's currently pretty much a cupboard that's underneath the ask that people can use if they're living out of town. And if we're expanding student numbers and expecting more people to come from outside of the university into St Andrews, then we have to take that into account and provide better spaces for them. And that's probably where the Director of Representation role comes in terms of accommodation.
Something else you talk about in your manifesto, and you mention it several times, is gender and ethnic diversity. But in terms of policies, there's not really much in there that we could find. What are you going to do? What meat do you have behind these great words? Everyone wants gender and ethnic diversity, but what are you going to do about increasing that?
We currently have a program for science students at the moment, which brings into, allows female students to effectively engage with mentorship schemes, both within the university and also out with vocational careers opportunities. And I feel like this is something that at the moment isn't particularly well used. At the moment, their Facebook group only has 98 members, for example, and I feel like the union itself could do quite a good push, particularly through the school presidents, to really, really push that forwards and get people to actually make use of it. In terms of arts, we do not have anything like that. But this year, in the School of Philosophy, under their school president, Eleanor Mullen, a Women in Philosophy Society has been created, through which the academic school and the staff within that school have been supporting students in terms of their development within the School of Philosophy and where they can go afterwards. And I feel like this is a really good scheme that could quite easily be rolled out throughout the entirety of the arts faculty, providing we actually engage with the groups that would be able to set it and put it forwards. And ultimately, that's not something I can dictate, but it's very much something that I can support and I can facilitate.
Finally, something we noticed in your manifesto was that you say that you're going to respond to all emails in 48 hours. Isn't that quite a long time?
Okay, it seems like a really long time. I'll explain that. First of all, the Director of Representation this year currently works incredible hours. I quite frequently get emails at 4 or 5 in the mornings with various other things, and I think that it's quite feasible for you to be in a meetings effectively from 9 a.m. until 7 p.m. at night, and then come home to a full inbox. And ultimately, I would want to get those emails dealt with as quickly as possible. And that's what I do in the School of History at the moment. Emails tend to get responded to within minutes because it goes straight through to my phone. However, I don't want to promise high and then fail to deliver because I'm prioritizing bigger policies in my manifesto than my email one. Ultimately, I would rather promise a 48-hour one and absolutely stick to it and make sure that everyone gets emails within that 40, because let's remember, 48 hours minimum does include a 1 hour or 5-minute response, then potentially fail to and break one of my promises just because I've overpromised.
Well, Jack Carr, thank you very much for the interview and good luck with the election.